Today I'm going to be making a wooden work table with folding legs. The materials for this project are 4 2x3s, one 1x4, some assorted fasteners, and for the top I've got a quarter sheet 2 foot by 4 foot of 5/8 plywood that I'm going to top off with some 1/4 inch MDF. First I need to mark and cut the 2x3s. For the frame of the table I need 2 sides that are 45 inches long and 2 ends that are 18 inches long. I also need to cut 4 legs. The length of the leg is determined by how high I want the table to be, less the thickness of the top, which is going to be 7/8 of an inch. Some of these 2x3s are a little shaggy feeling on one side, so I'm going to go ahead and give those a bit of a sand. There, that's better. I need to mark some screw hole locations on both ends of these 45-inch long sides. I'm going to put the screws 3/4 of an inch in from the end and 1/2 an inch in from each side. So I'll just use these handy marking blocks of mine. I also need to drill a 1/4 inch bolt hole at each end of this as well. Now I'm going to want that hole to be 2 3/4 of an inch in from the end and centered. Since I'm going to have to drill quite a few bolt holes, I took and I measured the center of this piece of scrap 2x3 and marked a line. Now I can use that as a marking guide. I also need to mark one end of each leg for a 1/4 inch bolt hole. I'm going to want that 1 1/4 in from the end and centered. And on the legs, I need to make that mark on both sides. I wanted that marked on both sides because I'm going to round over the end of each leg. I'm going to set my compass to 1 1/4 and mark a line on each side. So now I'm going to drill my 1/4 inch holes. I've got this extension attached to the drill press, and I got a couple of blocks on it so I don't drill into this extension. Now it's very important that once I get this lined up that I make sure I push firmly down. That way I'm going to get a nice straight hole. You can use a hand drill, but it's pretty tough to get a straight hole if you try to drill all the way through like this. Unless you're very talented, you usually end up with a hole that's pretty crooked. A better way to do it is to carefully mark both sides. Then you drill about halfway in from each side, and you should end up with a fairly straight hole. It's also very important to make sure that your drill bit doesn't skate out of position when you start drilling the holes. You end up with a much better result. Next, I want to round over the end of the legs that I marked with the compass. And to do that, I'm going to use my belt sander. But first, I want to clean my sanding belt a little bit. So I got one of these cleaning sticks. It's made out of kind of a rubbery plastic, and they work really good. You just have to be careful that you don't jam the belt. It's time to assemble the frame. These 18-inch long end pieces go on the inside like this. And I'm going to secure these with some self-drilling, self-countersinking screws. Now you don't have to use self-drilling, self-countersinking screws. The important thing is just make sure the heads are countersunk. Now even though these are self-drilling, I'm still going to drill some holes. That way I can make sure nothing splits on me. Once the frame is screwed together, I can attach the legs using 1/4 inch by 3 1/2 inch long hex head bolts. I'm also going to use fender washers and hex nuts. Now on this end, the legs go on the outside. It doesn't need to be real tight for now. At the other end, the legs go on the inside. it's important to note that fender washers also go on all the bolts on the side where the nut goes. Next, I want to put a cross brace across each set of legs down here towards the bottom somewhere. But first, you may note how it's kind of sproinged out a bit in a few places. So I'm going to clamp this all up so it's nice and straight. The brace for these inside legs are going to be about 18 inches less a 16th. For the outside legs, it's going to be 24 inches less a 16th. I'm going to cut those from the 1x4. I'm going to mark some screw locations. 3/4 and 3/4 should be pretty good. I also want to make a mark on the other side of the board, right in the middle. I'm going to use this 2x3 as a spacer. I'll just line it up so it's even with the bottom of the legs. I'll clamp it down, pre-drill it, and then attach it with these screws. Then I can do the same thing with the short brace on the inside legs. With the cross braces on, I can unfold the outside legs and then the inside legs. The next thing I need to do is to use some 2x3 to put a stop across each set of legs like this. Now, after cutting the sides and the ends and the legs, I've got this one piece left over, and it's too short to make both stops. So that's why we needed to have 4 2x3s. But at least 2x3s are cheap, and it doesn't hurt to have some extra on hand in case you mess up the bolt holes in one of the legs or something. I've put a clamp at each end. Now, as long as it's nice and tight here, and this is nice and tight up against this, the legs should be perpendicular. Remember that spot that I marked here in the middle of these cross braces? That's where I'm going to attach a small angle bracket. But before I put that on there, I need to drill out one of these holes so that a 1/4 inch bolt can pass through it. I want to make sure that the screw goes into the hole that I didn't drill for the bolt. Those brackets are going to be the attachment point for a long piece of 1x4 that's going to act like a brace to keep the legs from folding up. That measures out to be 41.5 inches. Well, I'm going to add another 1/8 of an inch to that, so that way the legs will be nice and tight. I actually cut this a little bit longer than I said, because if I put it in and it's too tight, I can always make it shorter, but I can't make it longer. Now I want to mark a line at each end, about 1 inch long, down the center. That's going to help me line it up on the brackets. I can put the brace up on the brackets, and then line up that line so it's in the center of that top hole of the bracket. I'm going to mark where that hole is with a nice sharp pencil. I'm going to put a 1 inch long 1/4 inch bolt in each of these brackets and secure it with a hex nut. So now I need to drill some holes into this long brace to fit those bolts. I also have to make a larger 5/8 hole to make room for the nuts that are holding the bolts onto the bracket. Best thing for that is either a Forstner bit or you can use a spade bit. Just doesn't make as nice a hole. Now, it's very important that I don't drill that all the way through. I only want to drill it about the thickness of the nut. Once I've got those 5/8 holes drilled, I'm going to drill a hole for the bolt. That's a 1/4 inch bolt, but I'm going to use a 9/32 drill bit to make sure that this can slide on and off easily. So you pop the brace on like that and secure it with a couple of wing nuts. And that'll keep the legs from folding up when you're using the table. As for these brackets, now that I've tried this a couple of times, they do kind of want to swivel around a bit. So I probably should have used a bracket like this that has 2 sets of holes. Oh well, live and learn. Much to my disappointment, I discovered that I didn't quite round this leg over enough. It's sticking up a little bit high. Well, it's no big deal. I'm sure it would still work pretty good, but I'm fussy. And it's not that big of a deal for me to fix this right now. I just need to take the brace off, then I take the leg bolts back out. Then I just pull this whole leg assembly out, And now I can take it over and sand it down a little more. This is the 5/8 piece of plywood. I've marked some screw hole locations on it. The screw holes need to be 2 1/4 inches in from the side. That way they're going to line up into the center of that frame. It's also important when figuring out where these screws go to take into account these screws that are holding the frame together. You want to make sure that you don't have a screw coming in and hitting those. So just keep that in mind when you're plotting out where to put your screw holes. I've marked all my screw holes and I'm going to turn this over now. The frame is sized so that it is 1.5 inches smaller all the way around than this sheet of plywood. That's the same thickness as a 2x3. So I'm just going to take one piece and clamp it onto the end of this board like that. And I've got this little bit longer piece that I'm going to clamp onto one side. Now I can take a little block like this and see how even it is. A little bit of fine tuning, and then I'll take some of my larger clamps and try to get them in so they're actually clamped underneath the table frame. Then I'm going to screw this 5/8 top down with some countersinking screws. It's important to make sure that these screws are nicely countersunk. Once I got this screwed on, I'm going to take it and flip it back up on my table for a minute. Now I'm just going to double check to make sure that the legs work smoothly. So now that I'm sure the legs work smoothly, I'm going to go ahead and tighten the bolts up a bit. Tighten that right up. And once each one is tight, it's best to put a second nut on it. Then, using 2 wrenches, you hold the one nut solid and tighten the second nut up against it. This acts as a lock nut. But even with that, after the legs have been opened and closed a few times, they might loosen up, so you might have to tighten those periodically. Now it's time for me to attach this piece of 1/4 inch MDF. It turned out that this 1/4 sheet of MDF was a little bit bigger than this 1/4 sheet of plywood, so I had to cut that to size. I've marked some screw hole locations around the outside of this MDF, about 3/4 inch in, as well as a few up the middle. Now I don't have any self-countersinking screws that are short enough to attach this. Anything I have will be so long that it pokes through the bottom. So I'm going to have to go ahead and countersink these manually. So there's the finished table. It's got a nice smooth top, and this 1.5 inch overhang provides a convenient place to put a clamp. To fold or unfold the legs, it works best if you tip the table up and then lean it up against something. This brace stores in there like that. Wing nuts back on the bolts. And then you just fold the legs in, making sure you fold these inside legs in first. It's got a little bit of weight to it, but it's not too bad. When you're ready to use the table, fold down the outside legs, then the inside legs, and pop this brace on and you're ready to go. Should come in pretty handy. Thanks for watching.